The last silver dime in the world felt cold against her palm. It wasn't enough for a meal, let alone a room for the night, which meant it had to buy her a future, or she wouldn't have one. The thought was so absurd it almost made her laugh, a dry, cracked sound that died in her throat. Her name was Ann Jing, though she had learned to answer to Annie, a name that slid more easily from American tongues. 18 years old, an orphan, and standing outside the swinging doors of the only saloon in Redemption, Wyoming territory, she knew her options had narrowed to this one desperate act. The wind cut through her tattered gray prairie dress, a garment so thin it was more a memory of wool than wool itself. Inside the saloon, the air was thick with the smell of wet leather, stale beer, and the kind of male confidence that comes from having $1 in your pocket and a roof over your head. Annie had neither. Her gaze scanned the room, past the card players and the loud drunks, landing on a man sitting alone at a corner table. He wasn't like the others. There was a stillness about him, a heavy quiet that seemed to bend the noise of the room around him. He wore a weathered sheepskin coat and nursed a single glass of whiskey, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular. He looked like a man who owned land, a man who might need hands to work it. Taking a breath that felt like swallowing ice, she moved through the room. The talk quieted as she passed, heads turning. A Chinese girl, alone, in a place like this, was a spectacle. She ignored the stares, the sudden silence, her focus entirely on the man at the table. She stopped before him, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. "Sir," she said, her voice small but clear, "I am looking for work. Any work. I can cook, clean, mend. I can tend a garden, milk a cow. I am strong." The man looked up. His face was weathered, carved by sun and wind, and his eyes, a pale, clear gray, held no surprise. They simply took her in, from the worn-out boots on her feet to the determined set of her jaw. He was Arthur Croft, a name she'd heard whispered in the general store, a rancher who kept to himself on a spread 10 miles out of town. He took a slow drink from his glass, his gaze never leaving her. "This is no place to be asking for honest work, girl." "Honest work is not concerned with place," she replied, the words coming out bolder than she felt. "Only with need. I need work. Perhaps you need a worker." He considered this, turning his glass in his large, calloused hands. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with the judgment of the entire room. Every man in that saloon was watching, waiting to see what Arthur Croft would do. He was a man of few words, known for his temper and his solitude since his wife had passed 2 years prior. Finally, he set the glass down with a soft click. "I don't need a cook," he said, his voice a low rumble, "and my cabin is clean enough for one man. Mending I can do myself." He paused, and a flicker of despair tightened Annie's chest. "I need a wife more than I need a worker." The words hit the room like a physical blow. A few men chuckled. One let out a low whistle. Annie felt the heat rise in her cheeks, a flush of shame and anger. She had come here for dignity, for a chance to earn her keep, not to be the subject of a cruel joke. She turned to leave, her last hope crumbling into dust. "It's a business proposition," Arthur Croft said, his voice stopping her cold. It held no trace of humor. "The Homestead Act requires a man to improve his claim for 5 years. With a wife, the government recognizes the family unit. It makes the final patent more secure, especially against men who want what's mine." He looked pointedly toward a man at the bar, a well-dressed rancher named Jasper Thorne, who quickly looked away. Annie turned back, her mind racing. This was madness. A marriage of convenience to a stranger she'd met in a saloon. But what was the alternative? Freezing to death in a livery stable? Starving? She looked at his face, searching for any sign of deceit, of wickedness. She saw only a profound weariness and something else, a straightforward honesty that was as stark and unforgiving as the Wyoming winter. "I need a partner to hold the land," he stated plainly. "You need a roof and a meal. I will provide for you. You will work alongside me. We'll have a justice of the peace make it legal. In exchange, you will not starve this winter." He leaned forward slightly. "Those are the terms. Nothing more is expected." The proposition hung in the air, a crazy, impossible lifeline. It wasn't a proposal of the heart, it was a contract for survival, spoken in the common language of the frontier: necessity. Her decision, she realized, had been made the moment her last dime failed to buy her a loaf of bread. Annie looked at Arthur Croft, a man as weathered and unyielding as the land he worked. She gave a single, sharp nod. "I accept your terms." The journey to his homestead was a silent one, the wagon wheels crunching on the frozen, snow-dusted ruts of the road. Arthur handled the team with an economy of motion, his focus on the path ahead as the sky grew heavy with the promise of a real storm. Annie sat beside him, wrapped in a thick wool blanket he had produced from behind the seat, her mind a whirlwind of disbelief and trepidation. She had traded her uncertain freedom for a stark certainty, but she did not yet know if the price was too high. The ranch was nestled in a small valley, protected on one side by a high ridge of granite. A simple clapboard house stood against the elements, smoke curling from its stone chimney. A large, sturdy barn and a series of corrals completed the homestead. It was isolated, windswept, and to Annie's eyes, the most beautiful place she had ever seen. It was a fortress against the world that had tried to crush her. But the sanctuary was immediately threatened. The storm, which had been a promise in the sky, arrived with the fury of a biblical plague. Snow began to fall in thick, wet flakes, driven by a wind that howled like a hungry wolf. By the next morning they were snowed in, the world outside reduced to a swirling vortex of white. The immediate crisis was not food or warmth. Arthur was well prepared. The crisis came from the sheer weight of the snow. A loud crack echoed from the direction of the barn, a sound like a giant bone snapping. Arthur was on his feet in an instant, pulling on his coat and grabbing a lantern. "Stay here," he ordered. But Annie was already wrapping her own thin shawl tighter, her face set. "2 sets of hands are better than one," she said, her voice firm. She would not be a helpless burden. That was not part of their agreement. He gave her a sharp look, then a curt nod, and they stepped out into the blizzard. The wind tore at them, stealing their breath. In the swirling snow, they could see the problem. A massive drift had accumulated on the north side of the barn roof, and a main support beam had splintered under the strain. A section of the roof was sagging dangerously, threatening to collapse entirely and crush the livestock huddled within. Arthur swore, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He grabbed a long pole, trying to push the snow off, but it was too heavy, too deep. The wood groaned in protest. Therefore, he had to get on the roof to shovel it. It was a fool's errand in this wind, a risk that could send him plunging through the weakened structure. He began to climb the ladder he'd propped against the eaves. Annie watched, her heart pounding. He was strong, but he was one man against a force of nature. She looked around frantically, her eyes landing on the heavy freight rope coiled by the barn door. An idea sparked, born of desperation and the memory of watching railroad crews in California hoist timbers. "Wait!" she shouted over the wind. He paused on the ladder, looking down. "The rope! We can use the big draft horse!" He stared at her, uncomprehending. "What?" "Tie the rope around the base of that big pine." She pointed to a sturdy tree about 50 yards away. "Then run it over the peak of the roof and tie the other end to the wagon tongue. We hitch the horse to the wagon and pull the rope taut. It will act as a brace, taking the weight off the beam." It was a long shot, a piece of improvised engineering that could either work or hasten the collapse. Arthur looked from the rope to the sagging roof, then back to her face, illuminated by the flickering lantern light. He saw not panic, but a fierce, calculating intelligence. He had expected a quiet, desperate girl. He was beginning to see he had gotten someone else entirely. Without a word, he climbed down the ladder. He trusted her before he had even decided to. They worked in a frantic, silent rhythm, the wind whipping at them, the cold seeping into their bones. Arthur, with his brute strength, manhandled the thick rope, while Annie, quick and nimble, tied the complex knots she had seen sailors use on the docks in San Francisco. It was a desperate gamble. They hitched the powerful draft horse, old Samson, to the wagon and urged him forward. The rope snapped taut over the roof ridge, groaning like a cello string. The sagging roof visibly lifted, just an inch, but it was enough. The immediate danger had been braced. They stumbled back into the cabin, exhausted and half frozen, the storm still raging outside. Arthur added logs to the fire while Annie made coffee, her hands shaking from cold and adrenaline. They had worked as a team, a partnership forged in the heart of the blizzard. The storm lasted 3 days. On the 4th, the sun emerged, bright and blinding on the new snow. With the sun came a visitor. A sleigh, pulled by 2 fine-looking horses, cut a path toward their cabin. At the reins was Jasper Thorne, their neighbor. He was a man who carried himself with an air of unearned superiority, his clothes too fine for the frontier, his smile too quick and polished. "Croft!" he called out, his voice carrying in the still, cold air. "Saw the state of your barn roof. Came to see if you and your housekeeper needed any help." His eyes slid over to Annie, who stood in the doorway, and his smile tightened with a dismissive smirk. The word housekeeper was a deliberate insult, a public questioning of her place, of their arrangement. Arthur stepped out onto the porch, positioning himself slightly in front of Annie. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were like chips of ice. "We managed, Thorne. The beam held." "Did it now?" Thorne said, feigning surprise. "A heavy bit of work for one man, unless your new help is stronger than she looks." He chuckled, a sound devoid of warmth. The confrontation was public, witnessed by the hired man Thorne had brought with him. In the small, isolated world of redemption, reputation was currency, and Thorne was trying to devalue Arthur's with rumor and innuendo. Arthur didn't rise to the bait. He just looked at Thorne, his expression flat. "Annie is my wife," he said, the words simple and direct. "And she has a fine mind for physics. The roof is braced. We'll repair it properly when the thaw comes." The declaration silenced Thorne. It was a statement of fact, a drawing of a line in the snow that Thorne could not cross without declaring open hostility. The community had seen Arthur buy a license at the courthouse. They might whisper, they might judge, but a man's wife was his own business. Thorne's smile vanished completely, replaced by a cold assessment. He had come to see a man weakened, in need of a neighbor's help that would surely come with strings attached. Instead, he found a united front. "Is that so?" Thorne said softly, his eyes narrowing. "Well, congratulations are in order then." He tipped his hat, a gesture of mock respect. "Just be careful with that deed of yours, Croft. Paper can be as fragile as a barn roof in a storm." He flicked the reins and the sleigh turned, gliding away and leaving a trail of questions in the pristine snow. Arthur watched him go, his jaw tight. Annie stood beside him, the cold forgotten. She had seen the look in Thorne's eyes. This was not a simple neighborly rivalry over land. This was something deeper, something personal. Arthur had defended her, had called her his wife, with a conviction that went beyond their business arrangement. But as Thorne's sleigh disappeared over the rise, she knew the man's final words were not an idle threat. Arthur Croft was about to find out that a collapsing barn was the least of his troubles. In the days that followed, a quiet routine settled over the homestead. The thaw arrived, and they worked together, side by side, repairing the damaged barn. Arthur was a man of few words, but he was a patient teacher, showing her how to saw a straight line, how to drive a nail with 3 clean strokes. Annie, in turn, proved to be a quick study, her small hands surprisingly strong and sure. She brought an order to the small cabin that it had lacked, her quiet presence filling the lonely spaces. But a tension remained, a silent acknowledgment of Thorne's threat and the unaddressed reality of their arrangement. The revelation came one evening after a long day of work. They sat at the small kitchen table, the lantern casting a warm golden light. The silence was comfortable, but incomplete. Arthur had been staring into his coffee cup for some time, his brow furrowed. Finally, he spoke. "He's not just after the land," he said, his voice low. "He's after this valley. My father outbid his on this parcel 20 years ago. Thorne's never forgotten it. He sees it as his birthright." Annie listened, sensing there was more. "The deed," she prompted gently. "What did he mean about the deed?" Arthur sighed, a heavy, weary sound. He got up from the table and walked over to a small locked chest in the corner of the room. He opened it and took out a small leather-bound ledger and a folded piece of paper worn soft at the creases. He brought them back to the table. "My father," Arthur began, "was a good man, but not a good businessman. He borrowed money from a freight company back in '68 to buy more stock. He used a corner of this land, the part with the spring that feeds the whole valley, as collateral." He pushed the folded paper toward her. It was a loan agreement. The ink faded with time. "I've been paying it down every year. I've only got one payment left." "But Thorne," Annie started. "Thorne has bought the debt," Arthur finished, his voice grim. "He sent word with the circuit judge last week. The final payment is due in 30 days. If I miss it, he can legally file a claim on that parcel, on my water. Without water rights, the ranch would wither and die. It was a legal, bloodless way to destroy him." Annie looked at the ledger. The payments were meticulously recorded in a strong, steady hand. Then she noticed something else tucked inside the ledger. It was a daguerreotype, a small, silvered photograph in a brass frame. It showed a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, her hair pulled back neatly. "My wife," Arthur said, his voice softening. "Sarah." This was the object that held the weight of his silence, the reason for the profound loneliness that clung to him like a second skin. He wasn't just a widower. He was a man still in mourning. She loved this place," he continued, his gaze fixed on the image. "She's buried up on that ridge overlooking the valley. Selling any piece of this land feels like a betrayal. When she died, something in me just broke. I didn't have the heart for courting, for starting over. I just needed to hold on to this place. For her." He looked up at Annie, his gray eyes filled with a raw honesty. "That's why I made you that offer. It wasn't right, but I was desperate. I needed a partner, not a romance. I'm sorry if I misled you." Annie looked from the picture of the smiling woman to the weary man sitting across from her. Everything clicked into place. His gruffness, his solitude, the almost formal distance he kept. It wasn't coldness. It was grief. And in his confession she heard an echo of her own losses. "You did not mislead me," she said quietly. "We made a contract for survival, both of us." She looked back at the loan agreement, her mind working, piecing things together. "30 days," she murmured. "The payment is $500. It was a staggering sum, more cash than a rancher was likely to have on hand before selling his spring calves. "I don't have it," Arthur admitted, the words costing him his pride. "Not all of it. I'd have to sell half the herd to Thorne at his price to make the note. He's planned this." Suddenly, a new danger arrived, not in the form of a letter, but on horseback. 2 men, their faces hard and unfamiliar, rode into their yard. They were not ranchers. They were the kind of men who worked for men like Thorne, men who enforced contracts with threats instead of ink. The lead rider, a man with a long scar down his cheek, dismounted. "Croft," he said, his voice flat and menacing. "Mr. Thorne sent us. He heard you might be having trouble scraping together his payment. He's willing to be generous. Sign over the deed to the spring parcel, and he'll forgive the final $500. He produced a document from his saddlebag. It wasn't a proposal. It was an ultimatum, delivered by armed messengers far from the reach of any marshal. This was the escalation. The conflict had moved from legal threats to physical intimidation. Arthur stood slowly, his body language shifting from weary to wary. He was outnumbered, and they were armed. Annie's heart hammered against her ribs. She saw Arthur's hands clench into fists. A violent confrontation would be disastrous. He would lose, and it would give Thorne the excuse he needed to claim the ranch had been abandoned, or that its owner was a troublemaker. She had to do something. She stepped forward, placing a hand gently on Arthur's arm. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. Her eyes were not on the men, but on the document in the rider's hand. "My husband is a man of his word. He will meet his obligations." The scarred man laughed. "His word ain't worth $500, lady." "Perhaps not," Annie said, her voice taking on a cool, clear authority that surprised even Arthur. "But the law is. The Territorial Banking Act of 1874 states that any debt purchased by a third party is subject to a mandatory 60-day grace period upon written request to prevent predatory acquisitions." She was bluffing, pulling a half-remembered scrap she'd read in an old newspaper in a railroad camp, twisting it to her purpose. "My husband will be filing that request with the circuit judge. You can tell Mr. Thorne his payment will be delivered in 60 days, not 30. The men stared at her. They were muscle, not lawyers. They understood threats and force, not territorial banking acts. Her confidence, her use of official-sounding language, threw them off balance. They looked at each other, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. A 60-day grace period sounded plausible enough to be true, and they had no way of knowing otherwise. The scarred man grunted. "You heard her," Arthur said, his voice rock solid, backing her play. "Get off my land." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then, with a curse, the scarred man snatched the document back, climbed onto his horse, and the two of them rode off, stirring up dust. Silence descended. Arthur turned to look at Annie, his expression a mixture of awe and disbelief. "The Territorial Banking Act of 74?" he asked. Annie let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "I have no idea if it's real," she confessed, a small, shaky smile touching her lips. But they didn't know that either. In that moment, Arthur Croft made a choice. He could have taken the safe path, sold his cattle, and appeased Thorne. But Annie had just bought them time with nothing but sheer nerve. To honor her courage, he had to be just as bold. He would not sell. He would fight. It was a choice that would cost him his peace of mind, his savings, and could very well cost him the ranch his father had built and his wife had loved. He looked at Annie, this surprising, fiercely intelligent woman who was supposed to be a simple business partner. He realized their contract for survival had just become a pact of alliance. He was no longer fighting for the past. He was fighting for their shared future. By the following spring, the valley had come alive again. The snow had retreated to the high peaks, and the pastures were a vibrant green. The repaired barn stood strong, its new timbers a testament to a winter's hard labor. Beside the cabin, a small but meticulously tended garden was already sprouting neat rows of peas and lettuces, a splash of orderly life that had never existed there before. Arthur had found that Annie possessed a genius for making things grow. The 60 days she had won for them had been a frantic race against time. Arthur had made the grueling, week-long trip to Cheyenne to register a formal complaint against Thorne's methods, and to sell 2 of his best bulls, not to Thorne, but to a stockyard paying a fair price. It wasn't enough for the full 500, but it was a start. The rest came from a source no one, least of all Arthur, could have predicted. Annie, it turned out, was an artist with a needle. She had spent the long winter evenings mending not just their clothes, but creating intricate embroidery on spare pieces of linen. When Arthur returned from Cheyenne, she showed him the work. On the advice of the general store owner's wife, a woman who had initially been suspicious, but was won over by Annie's quiet dignity, he took them to the territorial capital. The delicate, beautiful pieces were bought instantly by the governor's wife for a handsome sum. It was enough. On the final day, Arthur rode into redemption and paid the debt in full at the registrar's office, with the circuit judge as a witness. Jasper Thorne was there, his face a mask of cold fury as the clerk stamped the document, paid. His legal ambush had failed. His attempt at intimidation had been met with a cleverness he couldn't comprehend. He had underestimated not just Arthur Croft, but the quiet Chinese girl who was now his wife. The town, which had once whispered about the strange arrangement, now saw something else, a partnership that worked. They saw a man who stood taller, and a woman who had found her place not behind him, but beside him. One cool evening in late May, Arthur and Annie sat on the porch, watching the last light fade from the sky. The air was sweet with the smell of damp earth and new leaves. For a long time neither of them spoke. The shared work and the victory over Thorne had forged a bond between them that was deeper than any contract. Arthur reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, soft leather pouch. He held it out to her. "This is for you," he said. Annie took it, puzzled. She opened the drawstring and poured the contents into her palm. A cascade of silver dimes, shiny and new, filled her hand. There must have been 100 of them. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with question. He looked at her hand, then back to her face. "I just figured," he said, his voice quiet and deliberate, "that a person ought to have more than one of those to their name." It wasn't a declaration of love, not in the way the poets wrote about it. It was something more solid, more real. It was a gesture of respect, an acknowledgement of her worth, and a promise that she would never again be left with nothing. It was his way of replacing the single cold dime that had represented her desperation with a symbol of their shared prosperity. She closed her hand around the coins, their weight a comforting anchor. She didn't say thank you. The words felt too small. Instead, she simply met his gaze and gave him a smile, a real one, radiant and full of a future she had never dared to imagine. He found himself trusting that smile completely. On the frontier, a home wasn't always built on passion or grand romance. Sometimes it was built on a foundation of shared hardship, mutual respect, and the quiet courage of 2 people who chose to face the storm together. It turned out that a partnership wasn't about what was spoken in a church. It was about who stood with you when the roof gave way, and who helped you build it back, stronger than before.